everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the origins of Lyme disease.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we've got some pretty interesting stuff to dig into. We're mainly focusing on this book called Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons
Okay.
by Chris Newby and an interview she did about it. So Lyme disease affects so many people these days.
Yeah, it really does.
So, have you ever thought about where it came from?
That's a good question. I mean, it's kind of a silent epidemic,
Yeah.
Like almost 500,000 people are diagnosed every year,
Wow.
just in the U.S. alone.
Yeah.
And there's still so much controversy surrounding it.
Yeah, and one of the things that's so sad about Lyme disease is that it's really hard to diagnose.
Yeah.
It can look like so many other things.
You really can.
Like from neurological problems to chronic fatigue. So many people go through this thing where they're like going from doctor to doctor for years and being told it's all in their head before they finally get a Lyme diagnosis.
Right. And the tests we have now aren't perfect.
Yeah.
So that just adds to the problem. And the fact that the symptoms can be so different.
Yeah.
It makes it even harder for doctors to figure out what's going on.
Okay, so let's talk about Willy Bergdorfer. He's the scientist who found the bacteria that causes Lyme disease.
Okay.
Seems like a straightforward discovery story, right? But there's a twist.
No.
Bergdorfer worked at Rocky Mountain Labs. You know, that place that's been all over the news lately.
Oh, yeah.
Even with those investigations into where COVID-19 came from.
I know, right? They've been researching infectious diseases for a long time there. Some of them a little concerning, to be honest. Especially the ones that could potentially be used as weapons.
And this is where it gets crazy. Bergdorfer admitted to working on weaponizing ticks.
What?
As part of the U.S. Bioweapons program.
No way.
Like, seriously, it's like something out of a spy movie. You know, Newby was interviewing him for her book.
Yeah.
And she describes this moment where a handler shows up. Like, they sent him to make sure Bergdorfer didn't say too much.
That is wild. It makes you wonder why they were so worried about what he would say.
I know, right?
Adds a whole other level to this story.
Oh, absolutely. And to make it even weirder, at the end of the interview, Bergdorfer goes, I didn't tell you everything.
Seriously?
I know. What does that even mean?
It's so cryptic. Like, there's definitely more to this story. Maybe stuff that's been kept secret on purpose.
So let's get into the evidence Newby found that connects Lyme disease to bioweapons research. One thing is that Lyme popped up in an area really close to a known bioweapons testing site. Like, that can't be a coincidence, can it?
Well, the location is definitely interesting. But what's even more compelling is this thing called Project 112.
What's that?
It was a U.S. military program where they actually sprayed germs from airplanes.
Hold on, they were spraying germs from planes?
Yeah, including tick-borne diseases. The idea was to simulate a biological attack and study what would happen.
Wow, that seems so reckless.
Looking back, it definitely raises some ethical questions. They kept Project 112 super secret for decades, and we're still figuring out everything they did. But the fact that they were releasing potentially dangerous stuff into the environment is definitely worrisome. And get this, the Army released a bunch of radioactive ticks in Virginia.
Wait, what?
Yeah, it was part of a study.
Radioactive ticks? Seriously?
On how ticks move around.
That's insane. What were they thinking?
I guess at the time. They just wanted the data. But they didn't really think about the risks of letting these ticks loose.
Yeah, did they even consider what could happen long term? Like, what if those radioactive ticks mutated? Or helped spread other diseases?
That's a good point.
It's kind of scary to think about.
Yeah, it shows how sometimes scientific curiosity needs to be balanced with, thinking about the risks and ethical stuff.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about chronic Lyme disease. There's so much debate about whether it even exists.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, there are a few things going on. One possibility is that the early research on Lyme was flawed, so we might not understand the disease as well as we think we do. And then there's the testing. It's not always accurate, so some people with chronic Lyme might be getting misdiagnosed.
So basically, if we're not even diagnosing people properly, we don't have a good idea of how common chronic Lyme really is.
Exactly.
And that takes us back to Chris Newby's book, Bitten. She presented all this evidence, but the mainstream media basically ignored it. And the whole idea of Lyme disease being connected to bioweapons was labeled a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And it's not just that they ignored her, they actually tried to discredit her.
Really?
Yeah. FOIA requests later showed that the NIH was actively trying to make her look bad.
Wow, that's messed up. Trying to silence researchers who ask legitimate questions really hurts scientific progress.
Yeah, and it prevents us from having open conversations about important stuff.
Exactly.
Newby even talks about this op-ed in the Washington Post. It was written by this NIH-funded researcher named Sam Telford, and he called the Lyme disease bioweapon theory a conspiracy, without even reading her book.
It just goes to show how strong some viewpoints can be, especially when money or reputations are involved. Scientists and researchers need to be open to new evidence and willing to challenge the way things are, even if it means questioning their own work.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for people with chronic Lyme disease?
Well, the good news is that there are some new tests being developed that could help with diagnoses. Newbie's actually pretty optimistic about them. She thinks they could be a game changer and force the medical community to finally take chronic Lyme seriously.
So maybe with better testing, more people will finally get the treatment they need.
That's the hope. But treatment for chronic Lyme is still a big problem, even though more and more people are experiencing long-term symptoms. The NIH hasn't funded a major treatment study in over 20 years.
What?
Yeah, most of their funding goes to basic research. While millions of people are struggling with chronic Lyme and have very few treatment options.
That doesn't seem right. These people need help now, not in 20 years.
I know it's tough. Research often moves slowly. But patients need help now. It makes you think about whose interests are really being served.
So what's next for Chris Newby? Is she giving up?
Not at all. She's actually working on a new book
Hmm?
about lab leaks and government cover-ups. She's determined to expose these tactics and prevent them from happening again.
Good for her.
She's also working with Invisible International to educate healthcare providers about tick-borne illnesses.
It's great that she's using her platform to make a difference.
Yeah, it's really inspiring. She's not afraid to challenge the status quo.
And she's not alone. She mentions that some academics have spent their whole careers researching Lyme disease. They've published tons of papers,
Yeah.
all based on the idea that Lyme is easy to treat and cure. They have a lot riding on that narrative being true, even if it's not the whole story.
It's understandable. People want to defend their work. But in science, you have to be open to new information and willing to change your mind when new evidence comes up.
It's like they're so focused on their own little piece of the puzzle
Yeah.
that they've missed the bigger picture.
Exactly. And unfortunately, that's had real consequences for people with Lyme disease who are still looking for answers and effective treatment.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Are there other illnesses out there that we're just not getting right because we're stuck with old research and assumptions?
That's a good question. The whole Lyme disease thing really shows how important it is to be open to new ideas.
Yeah.
Even in science, sometimes the answers are outside the box.
So after all this, where do we go from here? What should our listeners take away from this?
I think the main thing is you got to be your own advocate for your health. Do your research. Ask questions. Don't be afraid to get a second opinion.
That's so true. It's easy to just trust what doctors tell us, but sometimes you need to dig deeper, especially with complicated health issues.
Absolutely. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about your health,
Mhm.
the better you can navigate the system and make good choices.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about Lyme disease, and I bet our listeners have too.
It's definitely a complicated issue, but hopefully we've cleared some things up about where it came from, the controversy surrounding it, and the challenges people face getting diagnosed and treated.
If anyone wants to go even deeper into this story, I highly recommend Chris Newby's book, Bitten. It's a really interesting read, and it'll definitely change how you think about Lyme disease.
And for those who want to keep exploring, check out Newbie's work with Invisible International. They're doing amazing work to educate healthcare providers and support those affected by Lyme disease.
Before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought. We've uncovered some pretty unsettling stuff about the potential link between bioweapons research and Lyme disease. We've also seen how some scientific ideas can be so resistant to change, even when there's new evidence. So here's my question. What other areas of research might be hiding secrets? What other health issues are we maybe overlooking? Because we're too afraid to question the way things are.
It's worth thinking about. The Lyme disease story shows us that we should always be a little skeptical and open to different perspectives. Sometimes the biggest discoveries come from those who dare to challenge the norm.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration.